The question is as follows. La question est la suivante. Madame Landsman, appuyée par...
Ms Landsman, seconded by Mr Hollande, moved that given that after 9 years of this Liberal Prime Minister, one, monthly rent and mortgages payments have doubled. May I dispense? The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started. I didn't hear anyone asking that it not be dispensed. Back to 1, monthly rent and mortgages payments have doubled. 2, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, finds that Canada has the most unaffordable housing market in the G7 and the second most unaffordable in the entire OECD. 3, Habitat for Humanity finds that almost 1/3 of Canadian millennials would consider relocating to another country to find affordable housing.
4, the PBO says that chronic homelessness is up by 38% across Canada since 2018, despite Liberal promises to eliminate it by 2030. In order to save Canadian homebuyers up to $50,000 or $2,500 per year in mortgage payments, the House called on the Liberal government to immediately eliminate the federal sales tax on new homes sold under $1 million and called on the provincial premiers to match this proposal. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person.
All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Ms. Dancho.
Ms. Dancho.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Commit.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Currick.
Mr. Kirk.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas South Glengarry.
Mr. Duncan Stormadunda South Glengarry.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abu Tayyip.
Mr. Abu Tayyip.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Straw.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Culkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur
Correction.
Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gourde.
Monsieur Gourde.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mrs. Falk.
Battleford.
Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shield.
Mr. Shield.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul's.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto St. Paul.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Ms. Dance.
Ms. Dance.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Monsieur Bouderis.
Mr. Boderis.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Arillo.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Que tous ceux qui s'opposent à la motion
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Ms. Ng.
Ms. Ng.
Mr. Guilbeault.
Monsieur Guibault.
Ms. Hutchings.
Ms. Hutchings.
Ms. Tassie.
Ms. Tassie.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Chager.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scroll.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Kara.
Ms. Kara.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Ms. Jazek.
Ms. Jazik.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dollywall.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fagascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Ms. de Brewston.
Mr. Brewson.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Monsieur Lozon.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Ms. Zarowitz.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Monsieur Yakano.
Mr. Yakano.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Dogood.
Mr. Dogood.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Serré.
Monsieur Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Hefner.
Miss Hefner.
Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. Hanley.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
Monsieur Barcelot-Duval.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
La Chambre attendra maintenant.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Je désire informer la Chambre que
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
le Bureau va maintenant
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 146, 146. Nays contre 186, 186.
Je déclare la motion
I declare the motion rejected.